The dust-choked wind carried Elijah Lawson's grief across the Texas plains like a wounded cry as he stood over the fresh grave. Two small children clinging to his weathered hands. Their faces streaked with tears they didn't fully understand. His wife Sarah had been taken by the fever 3 days prior, leaving him alone with a 5-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter in the unforgiving frontier of 1876. "Papa, when's Mama coming back?" little Anna asked, her tiny fingers tightening around his calloused palm. Elijah swallowed hard, his throat constricting as he knelt down beside his children. "Mama's gone to heaven now, darlin'. She ain't. She's not coming back." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. His son Thomas stood silently, trying to be brave like his father had taught him, but his bottom lip trembled with the effort. Elijah gathered both children into his arms, their small bodies shaking with sobs against his chest. His own tears fell into his daughter's golden hair, so much like her mother's that it was another cruel reminder of what he'd lost. Behind them, the modest homestead they'd built together over 6 years of marriage stood as a monument to broken dreams. Inside those log walls were reminders of Sarah, everywhere her half-finished quilt on the rocking chair, the bread she'd been teaching Anna to knead, the pressed wildflowers she collected each spring. "Mr. Lawson," came a gentle voice from behind. Elijah turned to see Reverend Wallace, his expression solemn. "My deepest condolences if there's anything you need." Elijah nodded stiffly. "Thank you for the service, Reverend." His voice was rough as sandpaper. "The community is here for you," the older man assured him, glancing at the children with pity. "Mrs. Timmons has offered to take the little ones while you adjust." A surge of protectiveness washed over Elijah. "They're staying with me. They're all I got left." The Reverend didn't argue, simply nodding before retreating to his wagon where the last of the funeral attendees were gathering to leave. The small procession of neighbors and townsfolk who'd ridden out to the Lawson homestead began their journey back to Silver Creek, leaving the small family alone with their fresh grief. That night, after struggling to prepare a simple meal and put the children to bed, Elijah sat alone at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey his only companion. Sarah had always handled the cooking, the cleaning, the children's bedtime stories. He'd been responsible for the cattle, the crops, the protection. Now he was responsible for everything, and the weight of it crushed down on his chest until he could barely breathe. "I can't do this without you," he whispered to the empty chair where she should have been sitting. "I don't know how." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of inadequacy and desperation. Elijah would rise before dawn, stumble through making breakfast for the children, try to maintain the ranch while also keeping Anna and Thomas in his sight. The cattle began to suffer from neglect. The vegetable gardens Sarah had meticulously tended withered under the harsh summer sun. Anna cried for her mother each night, and Thomas had grown unnaturally quiet, taking to following Elijah around like a shadow, as if afraid his father might disappear too. Elijah's hands, once steady with a rope or reins, now trembled as he attempted to comb his daughter's hair or button his son's shirt. After 2 weeks of this desperate existence, a wagon appeared on the horizon one sweltering afternoon. Elijah was attempting to repair a fence while the children played with sticks in the dirt nearby. He straightened, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip as he squinted against the sun. The wagon approached slowly, driven by a woman he didn't recognize. As it drew closer, he saw she was perhaps in her mid-20s, with chestnut hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet. She pulled the horses to a stop a respectful distance away. "Mr. Lawson," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. "I'm Grace Novak. Reverend Wallace sent me." Elijah approached cautiously, keeping himself between the stranger and his children. "What business do you have here, Miss Novak?" She climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, her simple blue dress dusty from the journey. "I've come to help, Mr. Lawson, the Reverend and Mrs. Wallace were concerned about you and the children." Elijah's pride bristled. "We're managing just fine." Grace's eyes, a warm amber color, took in the scene around them, the untended garden, the children's unwashed faces, the fence posts leaning at precarious angles. Her expression held no judgment, only quiet understanding. "I'm sure you are," she said gently. "But everyone needs help sometimes. I've worked as a school teacher and a nurse. I'm handy around a homestead too. My father raised me alone after my mother passed, so I know something of what you're facing." Thomas had crept closer, curious about the visitor. Anna remained where she was, watching with wide eyes. "We don't need charity," Elijah said firmly. "It's not charity, Mr. Lawson, it's community." Grace reached into the wagon and pulled out a covered basket. "I've brought some fresh bread and stew. Perhaps we could discuss the arrangement over a meal. The children look hungry." As if on cue, Thomas's stomach growled audibly. Elijah looked down at his son, then at Anna, noticing how their clothes hung looser than they had just weeks ago. He'd been so consumed with grief and overwhelmed by his new responsibilities that he hadn't realized how poorly he was caring for them. "One meal," he conceded reluctantly. "Then we'll talk." Grace's smile was gentle but determined. "That seems fair." She followed him to the house, carrying her basket and another small bag. The cabin's interior was in disarray, unwashed dishes piled in the dry sink, clothes scattered about, dust collecting on surfaces Sarah had always kept spotless. Grace said nothing about the state of things, simply setting her basket on the table and removing her bonnet. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the cold stove. Elijah nodded, suddenly embarrassed by the condition of his home. "Children, wash up," he instructed, finding a small measure of comfort in giving a direction he knew was right. Grace moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the stove and warming the stew she'd brought. Within minutes, the cabin filled with the aroma of good food, making Elijah realize how long it had been since he'd tasted anything that wasn't burned or half raw. The children watched her with fascination as she set the table, using the mismatched dishes she found in the cupboard. "I'm Miss Grace," she introduced herself. "And you must be Thomas and Anna. The Reverend told me about you. Are you a friend of Mama's?" Anna asked innocently. A flash of pain crossed Elijah's face, but Grace answered smoothly. "No, sweetheart, I didn't have the pleasure of knowing your mama, but I've heard she was a wonderful lady who loved you very much. She's in heaven now," Anna informed her solemnly. "Yes, I know," Grace replied, serving the stew into bowls. "My mama's in heaven too, has been since I was about your age." This revelation seemed to interest both children, and soon they were eating with more appetite than Elijah had seen in days, listening as Grace answered their questions about herself with simple honesty. Elijah observed the interaction with mixed emotions. Relief that the children were eating properly warred with the sharp ache that this stranger was sitting in Sarah's place at the table, tending to her children. After the meal, Grace suggested the children might enjoy playing outside while she spoke with their father. Once they were gone, she turned to Elijah, her expression direct but kind. "Mr. Lawson, I understand your reluctance, but those children need more care than you can provide alone while also maintaining this ranch. And what do you propose?" he asked stiffly. "I'll stay on as their caretaker and your housekeeper. I can cook, clean, tend to the children, and even help with some of the lighter ranch work. I grew up on a farm north of here." "And what would you want in return?" "Room and board, plus a small wage when you're able." "I've been saving to buy my own place someday, but that's not urgent," Elijah frowned. "Why would you leave your position in town to come help a stranger?" Grace's eyes softened. "Because I know what it's like to be those children. My father did his best after my mother died, but he couldn't be everything. They need a woman's care, Mr. Lawson, especially little Anna." Her words struck a chord Elijah didn't want to acknowledge. He'd been failing his children, too proud to admit he couldn't be both mother and father to them. "There's talk in town," Grace continued carefully, "about whether you can manage on your own. Some folks think the children might be better off with another family until you recover." Cold fear gripped Elijah's heart. "They wouldn't dare take my children." "Not unless they had cause," Grace replied, "but letting me help would show you're doing right by them." Elijah stood and paced the small cabin, running a hand through his unkempt hair. The thought of a stranger living in their home, caring for his children, using Sarah's things, it felt like another betrayal of his wife's memory. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. 2 weeks, he finally said. "We'll try it for 2 weeks. There's a small room off the kitchen where you can stay." Relief washed over Grace's face. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. I promise I'll respect your home and your ways. I'm here to help, not to replace anyone." Her understanding of his unspoken fear loosened something tight in his chest. "The children need baths and there's laundry to be done," he said gruffly, already feeling the strange relief of sharing the burden. "I'll see to it right away," Grace promised, rising from the table. "And perhaps tomorrow you might show me around the ranch so I can better understand your needs." Elijah nodded curtly, then went outside to fetch the children and explain the new arrangement. Thomas seemed cautiously optimistic, while Anna immediately brightened at the news. "Miss Grace makes good stew," his daughter said simply, as if this settled the matter. That night, after Grace had bathed both children, mended a tear in Thomas's shirt, and told them a story before bed, Elijah found himself sitting on the porch, listening to the sounds of her moving about in the kitchen. The windows glowed with lamplight, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the cabin felt like a home again rather than a monument to his grief. He wasn't ready to acknowledge the comfort this brought, or the guilt that accompanied it. Instead, he focused on the practical benefits. His children were clean and well-fed. Tomorrow he could attend to the neglected cattle without worrying about leaving the little ones alone. And perhaps he could finally sleep without the crushing weight of inadequacy pressing down on him. Grace's arrival marked the beginning of a slow transformation at the Lawson homestead. The first week passed in a careful dance of boundaries and adjustments. Elijah maintained his distance, speaking to Grace only when necessary, focusing instead on catching up with the ranch work that had fallen behind. Yet he couldn't help but notice the changes. The cabin grew clean and orderly again. Meals appeared regularly, simple but nourishing. The children's clothes were mended and clean, their hair neatly combed. Most significantly, he heard something that had been absent for too long: laughter. Anna's giggles and even Thomas's cautious chuckles occasionally drifted to him as he worked outside. Grace never overstepped, never presumed to advise him on the children unless asked. She seemed to understand instinctively that her role was to support, not to replace. This careful respect gradually softened Elijah's rigid demeanor around her. One evening during the second week, he returned from repairing a distant section of fence to find the cabin unusually quiet. Entering cautiously, he discovered Grace sitting alone at the table, sewing by lamplight. "The children?" he asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Asleep," she replied, looking up with a small smile. "They helped gather eggs and vegetables today. The work tired them out." Elijah nodded, noticing for the first time the dark circles under Grace's eyes. She had been working from dawn until well after dusk every day, caring for his children, maintaining his home, and never complaining. "You should rest too," he said awkwardly. Grace set down her sewing. He realized with a pang that she was mending one of Anna's dresses. "I wanted to finish this first. Anna mentioned she missed wearing it. It was a gift from her mother." The reference to Sarah still hurt, but less sharply than before. "You're good with them," he acknowledged, the closest he'd come to expressing gratitude. "They're wonderful children." "You and your wife raised them well." Grace gathered her sewing materials. "I've left some stew warming for you. Will you need anything else tonight?" "No, but—" Elijah hesitated. "The 2 weeks are almost up." Grace paused, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, they are, I think. It would be best if you stayed on. The arrangement is working well for the children." Relief softened her features. "I'm glad to hear that. I've grown quite fond of them already." "They've grown fond of you too," Elijah admitted. "Thomas actually spoke about his day at supper last night." "First time since." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Grace nodded in understanding. "Children are resilient, Mr. Lawson. They'll always love their mother, but they're allowing themselves to be happy again. Perhaps in time you might allow yourself the same grace." Her words struck him like a physical blow, cutting through the armor of grief he'd wrapped around himself. Before he could respond, she bid him good night and retreated to her small room off the kitchen, leaving Elijah alone with thoughts he wasn't ready to confront. The following Sunday brought another change to their developing routine. Grace appeared at breakfast dressed in her best dress, a modest navy blue garment with a white collar. "I'd like to attend church service in town," she explained. "Would you and the children care to join me?" Elijah stiffened. He hadn't been to church since the funeral. The thought of facing the community's pitying looks was unbearable. "You go ahead, take the wagon." Grace studied him for a moment. "The children would benefit from the social interaction. They've been isolated here with their grief." The gentle challenge in her words made Elijah reconsider. Thomas and Anna deserved more than his self-imposed exile. "Fine," he conceded, "but we won't stay for the social after." The trip to town was Elijah's first since Sarah's passing. As they approached Silver Creek, he felt his body tensing, his jaw clenching tight. Grace seemed to sense his discomfort, engaging the children in conversation about the wildflowers blooming alongside the road, drawing their attention and his away from the looming social encounter. The small white church stood at the edge of town, its bell already ringing to call the faithful to worship. Elijah parked the wagon and helped Grace and the children down, feeling the weight of curious eyes as townsfolk recognized him. "Elijah Lawson," Reverend Wallace greeted him warmly at the church steps. "It's good to see you and the little ones here today." His gaze shifted to Grace with approval. "Miss Novak, I'm pleased to see the arrangement is working out." Elijah managed a tight nod. The children wanted to come. The Reverend didn't challenge the obvious deflection, simply ushering them inside. They took a seat in a back pew, Grace sitting between the children while Elijah positioned himself at the end, as if ready for a quick escape. The service passed in a blur for Elijah, his mind too crowded with memories of sitting in this same church, beside Sarah, to focus on the sermon. But he noticed how attentively Grace helped Anna follow along in the hymnal, how she gently quieted Thomas's restless fidgeting with a soft touch on his shoulder rather than a stern word. After the service, despite his intention to leave immediately, they were surrounded by well-wishers and curious neighbors. "Your children look well, Elijah," Mrs. Peterson commented, her eyes darting between him and Grace with poorly concealed curiosity. "Miss Novak has been a godsend," he replied stiffly, the admission difficult but necessary to establish Grace's position clearly in the community's eyes. "The Lawson children are a joy to care for," Grace added smoothly. "They're bright and helpful, a credit to their upbringing." Her diplomatic response seemed to satisfy the onlookers, and gradually the attention shifted away from them. As they prepared to leave, Thomas tugged at Grace's skirt. "Can we get candy from Mr. Wilson's store? Mama used to let us after church." The innocent request created a moment of tension. Elijah saw the conflict in Grace's eyes, wanting to honor the boy's memory of his mother while being sensitive to Elijah's feelings. "If your father agrees," she replied carefully. Elijah swallowed hard. "Yes, we can stop at Wilson's." The small detour to the general store provided an unexpected moment of normalcy. As the children excitedly selected their treats, Mr. Wilson engaged Elijah in conversation about cattle prices, while casting approving glances at Grace, helping Anna reach the peppermint sticks. "You've done well, finding help with the little ones," Wilson commented quietly. "Miss Novak has a good reputation. Turned down the banker's son's proposal last year, determined to make her own way, from what I hear." Elijah hadn't considered Grace's past, or why an attractive, capable woman would choose to work as a housekeeper on an isolated ranch rather than pursue marriage. The information shifted his perception of her slightly, adding complexity to the simple image he'd held. On the ride home, with the children happily enjoying their candy, Elijah found himself observing Grace more carefully. The sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, and her profile showed a quiet determination he hadn't fully appreciated before. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice low enough that the children couldn't hear over the wagon's rumble. Grace glanced at him, surprise evident in her amber eyes. "For what, Mr. Lawson? For making today easier, for knowing what to say to everyone, for—" He struggled to articulate the complex gratitude he felt, for helping Thomas remember his mother without making it painful. A soft smile touched Grace's lips. "Children need to keep their good memories alive. It's part of healing." As summer deepened, the rigid lines of their arrangement began to blur around the edges. Grace's presence became less that of an employee and more that of a partner in the daily operation of the homestead. Elijah found himself seeking her input on matters beyond the children's care, whether the garden was producing enough to preserve for winter, if they should trade with the neighbors for additional supplies, how to approach Thomas's nightmares that still occasionally disrupted the household. One hot August afternoon, Elijah returned from town with mail that included a letter for Grace. She took it with surprise, her eyes lighting up as she recognized the handwriting. "My friend Caroline from back east," she explained, tucking it into her pocket to read later. That evening, after the children were asleep, Elijah found Grace on the porch, her letter open in her lap, her expression troubled in the fading light. "Bad news?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Grace startled slightly, having been lost in thought. "Not exactly. Caroline has written with a teaching position opening in St. Louis. She thinks I would be perfect for it." An unexpected tightness seized Elijah's chest. "You're considering it?" Grace hesitated. "It's what I trained for. Teaching in a proper school has always been my goal. The salary would help me save for my own place faster." Elijah stared out at the darkening landscape, trying to imagine the homestead without Grace's steady presence. The children would be devastated, and he didn't want to examine too closely how he would feel. "When would you leave?" His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "The position begins in October. I'd need to leave by mid-September." Grace folded the letter carefully. "But I wouldn't go without ensuring you had suitable help in place, Mr. Lawson." The formality of her address suddenly irritated him. After months in his home, caring for his children, sharing meals and conversations, she still maintained that careful distance. "You should call me Elijah," he said abruptly. "Seems strange not to after all this time." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "I wasn't sure if that would be appropriate." "Nothing about our situation is conventional," Elijah replied with a wry smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Might as well be on a first-name basis while you're helping raise my children." A soft laugh escaped her. "You make a fair point, Elijah." His name and her voice created an unexpected warmth. They sat in companionable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Will you take the position?" he finally asked, the question that had been hanging between them. Grace sighed. "I don't know. A few months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now there are Thomas and Anna to consider. They've already lost so much." She turned to look at him directly. "What do you think I should do, Elijah?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. No one had asked his opinion on anything beyond ranch matters in so long. The realization that her decision would affect them all, that they had become something of a unit, settled over him like a revelation. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should do what's best for your future. But I also think the children would miss you terribly." He paused before adding, "As would I." The admission hung in the air between them, more significant than it might have seemed to an outsider. Grace's expression softened, and for a moment, Elijah thought she might reach for his hand, but she simply nodded. "I have time to decide," she said quietly, "and much to consider." The next morning brought no further discussion of the letter or the teaching position. Life continued its steady rhythm on the ranch, but Elijah found himself watching Grace more closely, noticing the gentle way she guided Thomas through his reading lessons, how she taught Anna to braid with patience born of genuine affection, not obligation. He began finding reasons to include her in more aspects of ranch life, asking her to help with the gentler horses, seeking her opinion on which calves to keep and which to sell, bringing her wildflowers he'd spotted while checking the property boundaries. This last gesture seemed to surprise Grace the most. When he handed her the small bunch of purple and yellow blooms one evening, her cheeks flushed pink. "What are these for?" she asked, accepting them with careful hands. Elijah shrugged, suddenly feeling foolish. "You mentioned liking wildflowers. Thought they might brighten the table." The smile that bloomed across her face made his momentary embarrassment worthwhile. "They're lovely, thank you." That night, after placing the flowers in a jar of water at the center of the dining table, Grace seemed more animated than usual, sharing stories of her childhood on her father's farm that had the children giggling and even coaxed a genuine laugh from Elijah. Did you always want to be a teacher?" Thomas asked her, more talkative than he'd been in months. Grace nodded. "Ever since my teacher, Miss Franklin, showed me how wonderful books could be. She opened up whole worlds for me when my own world felt very small after my mother died." "Like you do for us," Anna said simply, leaning against Grace's arm with the easy affection of a child who felt secure. Elijah watched the interaction with a complex mix of emotions. Grace had accomplished in months what he'd failed to do, helped his children find joy again without forgetting their mother. The thought of her leaving for St. Louis created a hollow feeling he wasn't ready to name. Later that week, a summer storm rolled across the plains, bringing much-needed rain but also fierce lightning that struck a tree near the barn. Elijah rushed out in the downpour to ensure no fire had started, ordering Grace and the children to remain inside. When he returned, soaked to the skin and shivering, Grace met him at the door with a towel and concern etched on her face. "Everything's secure," he assured her, accepting the towel gratefully. "Trees damaged, but nothing caught fire." "You're freezing," Grace observed. "Change into dry clothes while I make some hot coffee." Her gentle authority made him smile despite his discomfort. "Yes, madam." When he emerged in dry clothes, Grace had coffee waiting and had built up the fire despite the summer heat, recognizing his need for warmth. The children had been settled with a game at the table, giving the adults a rare moment of privacy near the stove. "You're good in a crisis," Elijah commented. Accepting the steaming mug she offered, Grace smiled. "My father said I got that from my mother. He used to tell me she was the calmest person he'd ever met until someone she loved was in danger. Then she became a force of nature." "Sounds like Sarah," Elijah said softly, surprising himself by voluntarily mentioning his wife. "She once faced down a rattlesnake that had gotten too close to Thomas when he was just learning to walk. Never seen anyone move so fast or aim so true with a garden hoe." Grace's laughter mingled with his own, and for the first time, a memory of Sarah brought comfort rather than just pain. They traded stories as the storm raged outside Grace, speaking of her father's stubborn determination to raise her alone despite neighbors' concerns. Elijah recounting how he and Sarah had weathered their first difficult winter on the homestead. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Grace said gently when Elijah described Sarah's unflagging optimism during that harsh season. "She was," Elijah agreed, finding that the knot of grief in his chest had loosened enough to let him breathe around it. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said what mattered most was having a good heart, and you've certainly shown that to my children." Grace ducked her head, a blush touching her cheeks at the compliment. "Your children make it easy to care for them." As August gave way to September, the question of Grace's decision regarding the teaching position loomed larger. Elijah found reasons to delay any discussion of it, and Grace seemed equally reluctant to bring it up. But time was passing, and choices would soon have to be made. The catalyst came unexpectedly one afternoon. When Anna fell from the low branch of an apple tree she'd been climbing against explicit instructions. Her terrified screams brought both Grace and Elijah running from different directions, Grace from the garden and Elijah from the corral where he'd been breaking a new horse. They reached Anna simultaneously, finding her clutching her arm and sobbing in pain. Grace immediately knelt beside her, gently examining the injury while murmuring soothing words. "It's not broken," she determined after careful assessment, "but badly sprained. We need to wrap it and keep it still." She looked up at Elijah, whose face had gone pale with worry. "Can you carry her inside while I gather what we need?" Elijah lifted his daughter with trembling hands, his heart still racing from the moment of terror when he'd heard her scream. Inside, Grace efficiently prepared a mixture of herbs she'd been growing in the garden, creating a poultice to reduce the swelling, before wrapping Anna's arm in clean strips of cloth. Throughout the process, she kept both Anna and Elijah calm with her steady presence and confident movements. When Anna was finally settled on her bed, dozing from the willow bark tea Grace had prepared for the pain, Elijah followed Grace back to the kitchen. "How did you know what to do?" he asked, watching as she washed her hands in the basin. "My father's farm was far from town." We had to learn to handle most injuries ourselves, she explained. And I studied with the doctor's wife for a time, learning about medicinal plants and basic treatment. You're full of surprises, Grace Novak, Elijah said softly. She turned to face him, drying her hands on her apron. Is that a good thing? It is. He stepped closer, the fear of almost losing another loved one still fresh enough to push him past his usual reserve. You've become essential to this family, to me. Grace's eyes widened at his words. Elijah, don't go to St. Louis, he said abruptly. Stay here, the children need you. And you? Grace asked quietly, her amber eyes searching his face. Do you need me too? The question hung between them, demanding a truth Elijah had been avoiding for months. In the silence, they heard Thomas enter the house, returning from checking on his sister's favorite chicken to reassure her when she woke. Pa, is Anna going to be all right? The boy asked, his young face creased with worry. Elijah turned to his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. She'll be fine, thanks to Miss Grace. Your sister's tougher than she looks. Like Mama was, Thomas said with the simple clarity of a child. Yes, Elijah agreed, his voice rough with emotion, just like your mama. Later that evening, with both children finally asleep, Elijah found Grace on the porch again, staring out at the star-filled sky. Without asking permission, he settled into the chair beside her. You never answered my question, Grace said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you need me too, Elijah, or am I just convenient help with the children? The directness of her question demanded equal honesty in return. Elijah took a deep breath, organizing thoughts he'd been avoiding for weeks. When Sarah died, I thought part of me died with her, he began slowly. I couldn't imagine ever feeling anything again except grief and responsibility. The children kept me going, but it was like moving through thick mud, every day a struggle just to breathe. Grace remained silent, giving him space to find his words. Then you came, and slowly, without me even noticing at first, things started to change. The house felt like a home again. The children started laughing, and he paused, gathering his courage. I started to feel again, not just the grief, but other things too, pride in Thomas's reading. Joy in Anna's singing, and something else I wasn't expecting. He turned to look at her directly, moonlight silvering her features. Yes, Grace, I need you, not just for the children or the house or the 100 practical ways you've made our lives better. I need your strength, your kindness, your way of seeing hope where I saw only loss. Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I've been telling myself it was wrong to feel this way, she admitted. That it was too soon, that you were still grieving, that the children needed stability, not confusion. All true, Elijah acknowledged. But does that mean what we feel isn't real? No, Grace said softly. It's real, too real to ignore anymore. Elijah reached for her hand, covering it with his own. I'm not asking for promises. I know there's still healing to be done, but I am asking you to stay, to give us a chance to see what this might become. Grace turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining. What about the children? How would they feel? They already love you, Elijah said simply, but we'd need to be careful, take things slowly. Their hearts are still fragile. As is yours, Grace added gently. Yes, he admitted, but stronger than it was thanks to you. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands joined, the weight of possibility between them. I'll write to Caroline tomorrow, Grace finally said. I'll tell her I've found where I'm meant to be. The relief that flooded through Elijah surprised him with its intensity. He brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers, their first physical contact beyond the accidental brushing of hands over chores or children. Thank you, he whispered against her skin. The decision made, they began a careful courtship under the watchful eyes of Thomas and Anna. Elijah was mindful of honoring Sarah's memory while allowing space for new feelings to grow. They were deliberate in how they presented the evolving relationship to the children, emphasizing that Grace would continue caring for them as she had been, with the possibility that someday their family might change again, but only if everyone was comfortable with it. Thomas, practical like his father, seemed to accept the development with cautious approval. Miss Grace makes you smile again, Pa, he observed one evening after Grace had gone to settle Anna for bed. She does, Elijah agreed, touched by his son's perception. Does that bother you? Thomas considered the question seriously. No, Mama wouldn't want you to be sad forever. She always said being sad was a waste of good living time. The echo of Sarah's philosophy in his son's words brought a bittersweet smile to Elijah's face. Your mama was a wise woman. Anna's response was more emotional, alternating between excitement at having Grace become a more permanent part of their family and moments of confusion about what it meant for her memories of her mother. Would Mama be mad if you married Miss Grace? She asked Elijah one afternoon while they collected eggs together. Elijah knelt to meet his daughter's eyes. No, sweetheart, your mama loved us all very much, and she would want us to be happy, even though she can't be here with us. Miss Grace said Mama sent her to take care of us because she couldn't anymore, Anna confided. Do you think that's true? The innocent question caught Elijah off guard. When did Miss Grace tell you that? When I was crying for Mama last week. She said maybe God and Mama worked together to find someone who could help us when we needed it most. Elijah blinked back unexpected tears. Miss Grace is pretty smart, isn't she? Anna nodded solemnly. And she makes really good biscuits. Not as good as Mama's, but really good. That she does, Elijah agreed, grateful for his daughter's simple way of making room in her heart for both women. As autumn painted the prairie in golds and russets, Grace and Elijah's relationship deepened. Their evenings on the porch became a treasured ritual, a time to share the day's events, discuss the children's progress, and gradually reveal more of themselves to each other. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, Grace sewing or knitting while Elijah whittled or reviewed his accounts. On a crisp October evening, with the first real chill of approaching winter in the air, Elijah finally gathered the courage to kiss Grace properly. They had been discussing plans for winter preparations when a natural lull fell in the conversation. In the soft glow of the porch lantern, Grace looked particularly lovely, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. Grace, he said softly, setting aside the ledger he'd been reviewing. There's something I've been wanting to do for some time now. She met his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. What's stopping you? Nothing anymore, he murmured, leaning forward to brush his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them aware of crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. But as Grace's hand came up to rest against his chest, Elijah deepened the kiss, one hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her sigh against his mouth. When they finally drew apart, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. I'm falling in love with you, Grace Novak, he whispered. I never thought I'd say those words to anyone again, but there they are, Grace's eyes shimmered with emotion. And I love you, Elijah Lawson. Your strength, your devotion to your children, your heart that's big enough to love again despite everything. Their second kiss held the promise of all that might come, sweet with the knowledge that what they felt was mutual and real. As winter approached, the community of Silver Creek became aware of the changing relationship between Elijah Lawson and Grace Novak. Some nodded with approval at the practical arrangement, others whispered about the propriety of it all, but most recognized the healing that had occurred for the entire Lawson family and were glad for it. Reverend Wallace visited the homestead one November afternoon, ostensibly to check on their preparations for winter, but clearly with another purpose in mind. I understand congratulations might be in order, he said after accepting a cup of coffee from Grace. Elijah and Grace exchanged a glance. News travels fast, Elijah commented dryly. Small communities thrive on it, the Reverend replied with a smile. Mrs. Peterson saw you two at the general store last week and noted a certain warmth between you. Grace blushed but met the Reverend's gaze steadily. We haven't made any formal announcements yet. We wanted to be certain the children were comfortable first. The Reverend nodded approvingly. A wise approach. And how are Thomas and Anna adjusting? Better than we might have expected, Elijah answered. They've grown very attached to Grace. We've been honest with them about our feelings while being respectful of Sarah's memory. That's all anyone could ask, Reverend Wallace said. Which brings me to my purpose here today. If you two are considering marriage, I wanted to offer my services, of course, but also my counsel if needed. Elijah reached for Grace's hand, a gesture that had become natural over the past months. We've discussed it. We thought perhaps after the new year, if the weather permits, time enough for everyone to adjust to the idea, but not so long that." He trailed off, looking to Grace to continue. "Not so long that our current arrangement raises eyebrows," she finished practically. "The children deserve stability, and while we've maintained propriety, we know how appearances matter in a small community." The Reverend's eyes twinkled. "Sensible as always, Miss Novak." "Well then, shall we plan for the first Sunday in January? The church is always decorated so beautifully after Christmas." As the Reverend departed, promising to return for Sunday dinner soon with Mrs. Wallace, Elijah pulled Grace into his arms. "January seems very far away," he murmured against her hair. Grace laughed softly. "Patience is a virtue, Mr. Lawson." "Not one of my stronger ones, I'm afraid," he replied, tilting her face up for a quick kiss. "But for you, I'll try." The Christmas season brought a festiveness to the Lawson homestead that had been absent the previous year. Grace involved the children in making decorations from pine cones, red berries, and strips of colored cloth. Elijah chopped down a small pine tree and set it up in the corner of the main room, a tradition Sarah had loved that he hadn't been able to face the previous Christmas. As they decorated the tree together, Anna suddenly grew quiet, her small face solemn. "What is it, sweetheart?" Grace asked, noticing the change. "Mama loved Christmas," Anna said softly. "She made special cookies shaped like stars." Grace knelt beside her. "Would you like to make star cookies together? Your mama might have left the recipe somewhere." Anna's face brightened. "In her special book. The one with all the recipes." Together they found Sarah's recipe book, its pages worn with use and stained with ingredients from years of cooking. Grace handled it with reverence, recognizing the treasure it represented to the family. "Here it is," Anna said excitedly, pointing to a page headed Christmas star cookies in Sarah's neat handwriting. "Shall we make these tomorrow?" Grace suggested. "We can all help." That night, after the children were asleep, Grace brought the recipe book to Elijah where he sat by the fire. "I hope it was all right, using Sarah's recipes," she said quietly. Anna was so excited about making her mother's Christmas cookies. Elijah took the book, running his fingers over his late wife's handwriting. "It's more than all right," he assured her. "Sarah would have wanted her traditions to continue, and there's no one I'd rather see carrying them on with our children than you." Grace sat beside him on the sofa, leaning against his shoulder as he turned the pages, sharing memories associated with various dishes. It was a moment of perfect harmony, honoring the past while embracing their future together. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, with a fresh blanket of snow transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland. The children woke early, rushing to see what Santa had brought. Simple gifts Elijah and Grace had secretly prepared, along with sweets and oranges that had been a special order from Mr. Wilson's store. Grace had knitted new scarves for everyone and sewn a beautiful dress for Anna from fabric she'd been saving. Elijah presented Grace with a hand-carved jewelry box he'd been working on in secret, the lid inlaid with a pattern of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, tracing the detailed work with her fingertips. "Open it," he urged softly. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small pearl. Grace's eyes widened as she looked up at him questioningly. "It was my mother's," Elijah explained. "I'd like it to be yours when we marry next month." "It's perfect," Grace whispered, blinking back tears of joy. Their wedding day arrived with the new year, bringing with it a sense of fresh beginnings. The small church in Silver Creek was filled with neighbors and friends, all gathered to witness the union that many had seen developing over the previous months. Anna served as flower girl, proudly scattering rose petals saved and dried from Grace's garden. Thomas stood beside his father, solemn in his best clothes, the gold wedding band that had been Sarah's entrusted to his care, until the moment it would be placed on Grace's finger. When Grace appeared at the back of the church, a simple bouquet of winter greenery and dried flowers in her hands, Elijah felt his breath catch. She wore a dress of deep blue velvet, her chestnut hair arranged in soft curls beneath a lace veil borrowed from Mrs. Wallace. But it was her radiant smile, directed solely at him, that made his heart swell with gratitude and love. As she joined him before Reverend Wallace, Elijah took her hands in his, marveling at how this woman had entered their lives when they were at their lowest and gradually helped rebuild what had been broken. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, acknowledging the journey that had brought them together and the family they were forming. When Thomas solemnly presented the ring, Elijah slipped it onto Grace's finger beside his mother's pearl ring, completing the circle. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Wallace declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss they shared was sweet with promise, bringing applause from the gathered community and giggles from Anna, who tugged at Grace's skirt immediately after. "Are you our mama now?" she asked loudly enough for the congregation to hear, bringing fond laughter from those assembled. Grace knelt to the child's level. "I will never replace your mama, sweetheart. But I promise to love you and Thomas with all my heart, to care for you, and to help keep your mama's memory alive always." Her thoughtful answer brought approving nods from the onlookers, and a suspicious moisture to Elijah's eyes, as he watched this woman who had so carefully considered the needs of his children even in a moment that should have been entirely about her own happiness. The celebration afterward at the town hall was joyous, with tables laden with food contributed by neighbors, music provided by local musicians, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Elijah surprised Grace by leading her confidently through a waltz. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked, delighted. "Sarah insisted I learn before we got married," he admitted with a smile. "Said she wouldn't have a husband who couldn't dance at their wedding." The mention of Sarah on their wedding day might have been awkward with another woman, but Grace simply squeezed his hand. She was right. A man should be able to dance with his wife. As the celebration wound down, they prepared to return to the homestead, now truly their shared home. The children, exhausted from excitement and dancing, fell asleep in the wagon on the journey back, Thomas's head resting on Grace's shoulder while Anna curled against her father. "They're going to be confused tomorrow morning, finding you in my room instead of your old one," Elijah murmured with a smile. Grace laughed softly. "I explained it to them yesterday. Anna had a lot of questions, as usual. Thomas just nodded and said it made sense since we'd be a proper family now." "Smart boy," Elijah commented. "Takes after his father." "And modest too," Grace teased, leaning against him despite the difficulty of doing so while driving the wagon. That night, after settling the children in their beds, Elijah and Grace stood in the doorway of what was now their bedroom, a moment of shyness descending despite months of growing intimacy. "I moved your things in while you were helping Anna dress this morning," Elijah said, gesturing to where her brushes and combs now sat on the dresser beside his razor and watch. Grace stepped into the room that had once belonged to Sarah and Elijah, aware of the significance. Elijah had prepared for this moment thoughtfully, replacing the quilt with one Grace had made during the autumn evenings, adding a vase of dried flowers on the bedside table, making space for her presence in what would now be their shared sanctuary. "Thank you for being so considerate," she said softly, "for understanding that this might feel complicated," Elijah suggested, coming to stand behind her, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. "It doesn't have to be, not anymore. We've honored the past. Now we get to build our future." Grace turned in his arms, lifting her face to his. "Our future," she echoed. "I like the sound of that." Their kiss deepened with a new freedom, the knowledge that they were now husband and wife, adding a dimension of belonging that transcended the tentative explorations of their courtship. As Elijah's hands moved to the buttons of her dress, Grace surrendered to the love she'd found when she least expected it, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought her to this man and his children when they all needed each other most. Spring arrived on the Lawson homestead with a riot of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. The adjustments of married life had gone more smoothly than either Elijah or Grace had dared hope. The children had adapted to the new family structure with resilience, still remembering their mother with love while accepting Grace's role in their lives with open hearts. Grace had transformed from housekeeper to wife and mother with grace and wisdom, never attempting to erase Sarah's memory, but building her own relationship with Thomas and Anna based on genuine affection and respect. One warm May morning, as Elijah prepared to ride out to check on a new calf born during the night, Grace approached him with a mysterious smile. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes sparkling with secret joy. Elijah paused in adjusting his saddle, turning to give her his full attention. "What is it?" Grace took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Elijah. In late November, the doctor thinks." For a moment, Elijah stood frozen, processing her words. Then a smile of wonder spread across his face. "A baby, we're having a baby," Grace nodded, laughing as he lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "Careful, I was a bit queasy this morning." Elijah set her down gently, his expression instantly concerned. "Are you all right? Should you be resting?" "I can delay checking on the calf, I'm fine," Grace assured him, touched by his concern. "Women have been having babies while working on farms since the beginning of time. I'm not ill, just creating a new life." Elijah pressed his hand against her still flat abdomen with reverence. "Our child," he murmured. "A new life indeed." They decided to tell the children that evening at supper. Thomas and Anna's reactions were predictably different. Thomas asked practical questions about where the baby would sleep and whether it would cry all night like the Petersons' new baby, while Anna immediately began suggesting names and wondering if it would be a brother or sister. "Will the baby call you Mama?" Anna asked Grace suddenly, creating one of those moments of delicate navigation that still occasionally arose. Grace met Elijah's eyes briefly before answering carefully. "Yes, sweetheart, the baby will call me Mama because that's who I'll be to him or her. Just like you and Thomas call me Grace because you had your own mama first." Anna considered this, her young face serious. "I think I might want to call you Mama Grace sometimes. Would that be all right?" Grace's heart swelled with emotion. "That would be more than all right, Anna." "That would be wonderful." Thomas, watching the exchange, nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. You do mama things for us, even if you're not our first mama." "That's a very mature way of looking at it," Elijah commented, proud of his son's understanding. As Grace's pregnancy progressed through the summer and into fall, the homestead buzzed with preparations for the new arrival. Elijah expanded the children's bedroom, adding a separate space for the baby that could eventually become another bedroom as the children grew. Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets, often with Anna's help, teaching the little girl simple stitches in the process. Thomas took on more responsibility around the ranch, proudly informing anyone who would listen that he needed to be ready to help more when the baby comes. His dedication touched Elijah deeply, recognizing how his son was maturing into a thoughtful young man despite the early losses he'd experienced. In late November, as the first snow dusted the prairie, Grace went into labor. Mrs. Peterson, who had assisted at many births in the community, was summoned to help, while Elijah paced anxiously outside the bedroom door, Thomas and Anna watching him with wide eyes. "Is Grace going to die like Mama did?" Anna asked in a small voice, voicing the fear that had been lurking in all their minds. Elijah immediately knelt before his daughter, taking her small hands in his. "No, sweetheart. What happened to your mama was very rare and very sad. Grace is strong and healthy, and Mrs. Peterson is here to help. Having a baby is hard work, but women do it every day." Thomas put his arm around his sister's shoulders. "Remember how Mrs. Turner had a baby last spring? She was fine, and now little Johnny is crawling everywhere." Elijah gave his son a grateful look for the practical reassurance. "That's right. And soon we'll have our own baby to watch grow." After several hours of labor, the cry of a newborn finally pierced the tense silence of the house. Elijah's head snapped up from where he'd been sitting with the children, reading to distract them. A few moments later, Mrs. Peterson opened the bedroom door, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a healthy daughter, Mr. Lawson," she announced, "and your wife is doing just fine." Relief washed over Elijah in a powerful wave. He squeezed his children's hands before standing. "Can we see them?" Mrs. Peterson nodded. "Grace is asking for all of you." They entered the bedroom together, Elijah leading the way with Thomas and Anna close behind. Grace sat propped against pillows, her face tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as they approached, her smile warm with welcome. Come meet your sister, she invited, carefully adjusting the blanket to reveal the tiny face of their newborn daughter. Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, his heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. The baby was perfect, a dusting of dark hair, her mother's delicate features, tiny fingers curled against the blanket. She's beautiful, he whispered, gently touching his daughter's cheek. Just like her mother. Thomas and Anna crowded close, their initial hesitation giving way to fascination. She's so small, Thomas observed in wonder. She'll grow, Grace assured him. Especially with a big brother like you to look after her. What's her name? Anna asked, carefully stroking the baby's hand with one finger. Elijah and Grace exchanged a look. They had discussed names at length, wanting something that would honor the past while celebrating their future. Sarah Hope Lawson, Grace said softly. If that's all right with both of you. Anna's eyes widened. You named her after Mama. Your mama was a very special person who gave me the two most precious gifts in the world, you and Thomas, Grace explained. Naming our daughter after her is a way of keeping her memory alive in our family. Thomas nodded his approval, his eyes suspiciously bright. Mama would like that. And Hope is a good middle name because you brought hope back to us, Grace. Elijah wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, too moved to speak immediately. The wisdom in the boy's words struck him profoundly. Grace had indeed brought hope back to their family when it seemed lost forever. That's exactly right, son, he finally managed. Hope is exactly what Grace gave us. As the family gathered around the newest Lawson, the winter wind whistled outside the snug cabin, but inside all was warmth and love. Elijah looked at the tableau before him, his children from his first marriage leaning against Grace, as she cradled their newborn daughter and marveled at life's unexpected journeys. 2 years ago, he had stood at a grave, certain that happiness had been buried along with his beloved Sarah. Now he sat surrounded by joy, his heart healed and expanded by a woman who had come into their lives at exactly the right moment, who had nursed not only his children but his battered heart back to life. What are you thinking? Grace asked softly, noticing his contemplative expression. Elijah smiled, reaching out to take her hand in his. I'm thinking about how lucky we are, how sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures if we're brave enough to keep going. And if we're willing to open our hearts again, Grace added, understanding perfectly. As baby Sarah made a tiny sound of contentment, settling deeper into her mother's arms, Elijah knew with absolute certainty that their family's story was far from over. There would be more challenges, more joys, more growth ahead. But they would face it all together, bound by a love that had been born of loss but transcended it, creating something new and beautiful from the ashes of grief. Outside, the first true snowfall of winter began in earnest, blanketing the homestead in pristine white, a clean page upon which the continuing story of the Lawson family would be written, not erasing what came before, but building upon it, honoring the past while embracing the future with hope and love.